Hello and welcome to a special episode of Eerie Essex being recorded in Colchester Castle in the prisons.
In the dungeon. So we're here today with Ben Paites and Charlotte Evans. We're going to be talking about the latest exhibition, Wicked Spirits.
So Charlotte, we're really interested in getting your opinion as somebody who's on work experience here. What do you think about how the exhibition has reframed what happened to these women, and in some cases men, from away from the Matthew Hopkins era? Do you think it's a good thing to change that for this day and age?
Yeah, definitely, because previously I think it's been much more, like, especially from the male perspective, and hasn't actually taken into account the women's stories and how quite often they are really unfairly accused. I think with the exhibition here, they really focused on individual women's stories, and they even have a list of all the names of the accused. So you really do get to understand how, in some cases, horrific it was for the women.
Mm. And do you think that's relevant to anything that's happening today? Is that something that you can see reflected in things going on around you? Or
I think we've definitely been getting better in terms of gender equality and things like that. However, there still is a long way to go. And I think changing the narrative on historical events helps understand how sexism is inbuilt completely in our society and how it's been going on for so many years. And it's really good to show progress of how it's changing and how the narrative is changing.
That's great. So we just had a brief tour through the exhibition. What was your favourite object in there? Do you remember any of them particularly, or is it?
Probably my favourite is the dried cat.
Yes, the dried cat. When we first started setting up this interview with Ben, I mentioned to him that I had a particular fear of that particular dried cat, as it was in an exhibition a few years ago called Hidden Treasures. And when I worked here, I used to occasionally wander around a corner and stumble upon it and forget it was there and then scare myself.
Okay, is there a particular person in the exhibition or a particular story that has you found touched you more?
I found the one, fortunately I can't remember the name of the man in Silverhead and his story, because I think it is really interesting that actually it did happen to men as well, although it was a lot more rare. For me personally, before I came and looked at the exhibition, I believed it was exclusively women, so that's something that I think I learned and I found really interesting.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, because I think that's the same with things, other kinds of misogyny. You always think it's about women, but also how it affects men as well.
Yeah, definitely.
There's something I could add on that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So one of the things you often see with accusations against men in this period is that it's often about consorting with witches.
Oh.
So very rarely do you get a man accused of witchcraft, although, as you say, there are some, like the case in Sybil Headingham. He doesn't have a name. But, a lot of the time when you look through the cases in history, when it comes to the men who were accused, it was because they were consorting with witches, which says a lot about how they ended up getting caught up in these things, as opposed to the women who ended up getting caught up in these accusations.
Yeah, I think there was one, I can't remember which one it was, there's a particular one, and it was because maybe they were having an affair, and there was jealousy.
Yeah.
How much before you came to work here, how much did you know about the witch trials? How much is it talked about in schools these days?
We covered Macbeth for English, so one of the parts of that was King James I and his book on demonology, and that was kind of brought up there. And then during history, we covered the Elizabethans, in which we did touch very slightly on witchcraft, although not that much. So it isn't brought up too much in schools, it's more linking to other areas, and such as Macbeth. Witchcraft is a massive theme, and it was more explored how Shakespeare presented the witches and how it compared with society, and the fact that Shakespeare wanted patronage from King James I, so he included witches because King James I had a specific interest in witches.
I didn't know that. Fantastic.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Charlotte.
You
did really, really well.
Yeah, no, that was really interesting.
You've got a future in media relations.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to talk to Ben now about some more in-depth questions about the exhibition. Ben, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you do at the castle?
Yeah, so I'm one of the collections and learning curators here at Colchester Museums. I have responsibility for, I like to think of it as telling the stories using the objects. So we work on exhibitions, we work on events, and we kind of, as curators, have an understanding of what our collections are and the sorts of objects we have. And we can use that knowledge to select the appropriate things to use in exhibitions and write the text and all that. My background is in Roman archaeology, so archaeology specifically. So coming into this exhibition was quite new for me. It's not a period of history I'm particularly familiar with, but I'm very passionate about telling the stories of underrepresented people throughout history. So that's why I was kind of put in charge of this particular exhibition.
We might ask a couple of questions that cover what you talked about upstairs, but just in case I didn't get everything, you don't mind repeating it. Okay, so how did the project come about?
So it began with the idea of a single case. We wanted to loan a copy of a book that we knew was at the University of Essex. That is the Malleus Maleficarum, which is quite an important book in the history of the witch trials. So we wanted to start with that and just look at the idea of bringing the stories of the witch trials out of the prisons, which is where we're sat currently and where the stories originally were being told, into the main galleries and into the permanent gallery space. We have a temporary display case that we use for those sorts of things, so it's just going to be a simple display in that case. Then at the end of 2021, we ended up meeting with the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic from Cornwall and the Museum of British Folklore, and we showed them the space that we had. We gave them a bit of a walk around, talked about some of the ideas we had about bringing these stories into the open, and they had some ideas of their own. They had some object suggestions of their own that they had in their collections, and it just grew and grew. And we started off by adding a couple of extra cases. Then we decided to use the entire northwest corner of the castle for these displays. We talked about having art installations, kind of other things to add to these typical traditional museum displays, and it ended up being the thing that it is today. I will say, usually our exhibitions, we spend several years planning, whereas this one was sort of turned around in 7 months. So it was a big opportunity for us to kind of get this done in a short period of time. The main reason is we tend to alternate big exhibitions between the towns. So we're here in Colchester, but we're also partnered with Ipswich Museums, and this year is their big exhibition year. So we weren't meant to do a big exhibition this year, but because of this opportunity with those other museums, we thought, well, of course we have to do that. So that's where we ended up with what we have today.
They are lovely in the Witchcraft Museum.
I was going to ask, how did they become involved in the first place?
So our director, Frank Hargraves, is he's one of the trustees of the Museum of British Folklore, and he has contacts then with those people, but also Simon Costin and Melanie Robinson, who founded the Museum of British Folklore. Also, so Simon is the director of the Museum of Witchcraft, and Melanie is a consultant curator for there as well. So a lot of crossed things between those organisations. Yeah, Frank approached them, and they were quite interested to see what we could do and how we could work together. They have worked with museums before. They helped with the Ashmolean exhibition a few years ago. They do tend to go out a lot to different places and museums and art galleries and things to do things, mainly because I'm guilty of admitting this. I have not been to the Museum of Witchcraft and Magic in Cornwall.
It is a bit
it's quite far away
to get to.
and quite difficult to get to. I
I
will go.
wanted to go.
It is amazing.
Yeah.
I only managed to go because I went to uni with a friend who lived around the corner.
There we go.
It is good. And there's no, what I find with these sort of like places, there's no gatekeeping. Everybody wants to help each other.
Yeah.
It's a really lovely
It's one
community.
of the nicest things we've found coming into doing this type of podcast.
Yeah, no one's like, you're doing what? It's like, you're doing what? How can we help? It's lovely.
That's good. So I've never been. But from my understanding of the place is that most of their displays are fairly static, which is why they go out to other places and do their temporary exhibition type work in other places, which is why we're very lucky that they've decided to work with us this year.
Actually, one of the things I wanted to say was that you said it took 7 months to put this exhibition together. And I think in some ways that's actually sort of made it feel really fresh. Like it feels like not an idea off the top of somebody's head, but it feels like it's a fresh thought. Like it's a different way of looking at it, and maybe something that's been ruminated on for a couple of years.
Yeah, I think the fact that it's kind of an exhibition that grew from an idea has allowed that to happen, rather than saying we're going to do this big exhibition on the witch trials and then having to condense it and then having to play around with things. Because we started small and we've actually said, what if we add this bit? What if we add this bit? That's kind of helped keep it contained. So I think that's definitely how it's ended up feeling like that.
Why do you think it's important to reframe the narrative away from Hopkins and towards the women involved at this time?
In a nutshell, Hopkins was an abuser and doesn't deserve any of our attention at all. So he does have a mention in the prisons area in the castle, as I mentioned, and that was the only place where we spoke about the witch trials. But what we realised is that what we need to do is tell the stories of the victims. They're the people who have been lost throughout history. Their names have been forgotten. Everyone, if you mention the witch trials, they'll say Matthew Hopkins, maybe John Stern, and a few other people. But it's Agnes Waterhouse, Ursula Kemp, Joan Prentice, all those people who suffered and died as a result of these laws that aren't remembered. And we wanted to bring those names out to the forefront and tell their stories, which aren't told anywhere else.
So, on Hopkins, do you think he actually believed he was catching witches, or do you think he was just in it for the money? Because a lot of people talk about how he bought this hotel in, was it Manningtree?
It was in Manningtree, though.
We actually did, I think there was one of the stories about him haunting that particular hotel as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think people talk about him haunting here as well, because obviously he came here to Colchester Castle. He used not these specific cells, but he used the cells here in the castle as a way to detain his suspects. But I think at the time, plenty of people did believe that witches were real and they are out to get you, and that's what led to that increase in fear and persecution. As to Hopkins, I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. I think he might have believed, but I think he also was definitely trying to make money. And in fact, that was one proud moment for the history of Colchester. The reason he kind of stopped here was because the people of Colchester chased him out because they realised he was trying to extort them. And so that's why he stopped working here. Because the people of Colchester, the people of Colchester have always recognised
We're good
these
at
things.
finding a swindler.
Yeah. And so Hopkins, was eventually chased out of the town. And the thing is, he operated across such a wide area, the whole of East Anglia and Essex, and he had plenty of opportunity to find who he wanted to find.
Yeah.
Really.
One thing that makes me edge more towards him believing and in it for the money was he stayed away from Canewdon, the village the Witchfinder feared to tread, because surely that would have been right for the picking. And I think he genuinely did believe, but stayed away from the real deal because he was afraid of them. He was more intent on going after these poor innocent.
Yeah, the man is the worst.
Yeah.
We have to watch our language because Bethan's children sometimes listen.
Not Anthony Hopkins.
No.
In the episode we did on witches, we had a right rant about Matthew Hopkins, and another podcast spoke about it and said, they really hate Anthony Hopkins. No, we really don't.
That's not a feud we wanted to start.
Very different person.
Very different person.
Yeah.
Actually, one of the things, going back to what we were talking about before, one of the things you were speaking about outside when we got to the case with the three witches from Shakespearean, about the kind of climate in the population at the time. There'd been civil war, been an ice age snap. I found that really interesting then, that the witches in popular cultures were gaining more prominence. It kind of reminded me of Satanic Panic in the 1980s.
Yeah.
How it started off in popular culture and then everybody sort of grew to fear it, but it was...
it's people seeing people's fear and using it.
You had the
Nixon's war on drugs. Yeah,
exactly. It was the climate at the time in the 80s that we had a recession, didn't we? And
it was sort of an answer to the free loving hippie before. It's like none of that evil.
Yeah, it does. These do come about at times of crisis, and especially when societies are being split and torn by different views and beliefs. Dare I say it's happening again?
Yeah, I was just thinking that.
That's why I think we thought this was a very timely exhibition to highlight the ways in which people can revert to the most debased kind of accusations and things with absolutely no evidence for it, when you're already in a state of fear and looking out for the enemy. This is the thing. I think the way society, not just here, kind of across the world, you see these patterns of society being polarised by different views. And again, this is something that happens throughout history. It's not new, but it's just seeing it very clearly again. And you say about stuff coming out in public culture. Again, I don't know if you've seen lots of witch stuff in TV and film and stuff at the moment. It's almost like people know people know it's happening and they're like, oh, just remember what happened before. But yeah, I think it's interesting how intrinsically kind of societal views and culture, popular culture, it's a two-way process. They feed into these fears in society, but then society then causes this surge in new media and new views.
There were the TikTok witches who tried to curse Donald Trump or the moon at some point, I think, as well.
Tried to curse the moon?
Yeah, it was weird. It was a weird time. It was during the election period.
Yeah. It was also during I think it was the Second World War, that the British government got witches to come to somewhere in the southwest, I think, to practice their rituals to kind of help defeat Hitler and protect Britain from invasion. So, like I think I mentioned before, maybe not while we've been recording, but there's definitely kind of, it's surprising how recent in history these things happen. And the last Witchcraft Act, the 1735 Act, wasn't repealed until the 1950s, replaced by another act, the Fraudulent Mediums Act. So it's still kind of in the legal system to look out for witches, whether they're now classed as mediums or not. I know they are different people, but within the law and within some people's perceptions, they're all lumped together as people on the fringes of society who have powers that they can't explain. At least they're perceived as that. And so that's why they're targeted by others.
That's actually a question I was going to ask later, but I might ask it now. In planning for this exhibition, did you consult or did you talk to current practicing witches?
So we consulted a wide range of different people. We had Simon Costin, director of the Museum of Witchcraft, he's described himself as he has magical practice, and he and Melanie isn't, but they were both heavily involved in the interpretation. So myself and my colleague Sophie, who's the other curator here in the museums, we wrote all the text. So we wrote it ourselves, having consulted, but then we ran that by a variety of different people. Right. So Simon and Melanie had a look at it. We sent the text to Professor Alison Rowlands at the University of Essex. We've also sent the text to John Warland, who is a local advocate and works a lot with pagan, Wiccan, modern witches in kind of the local area, and has done a lot of work to raise awareness and commemorate those who have lost their lives through the witch trials. So we wanted a range of different people and different experiences and voices to go through this. And even beyond that, when we initially, so we have a thing, just to go into a bit of a museum background, in case that's interesting to listeners, it might not be. Definitely. Every museum will do this in a different way, but what we do here at Colchester Museums is when we have an exhibition, someone or maybe two people will write the text, and then we have a thing called text group. And text group is where we get people from different areas of the museum service together, again, ideally with different beliefs, different views, different opinions, different perspectives, to come together and make sure that the text is firstly accessible, so that I think our target is that an 8-year-old would be able to read it fairly easily. Sometimes we have to include words that 8-year-olds might not recognise, but if we do, that means we then contextualise it. We say, so one example being linked to this, apotropaic. Some people may have never heard of apotropaic before. Basically, it means magical protection. So you kind of explain some of those words you want to use. So we go through this text group, and that text group does have people of different religions, different kind of sexualities, genders, all sorts of different things. Obviously, we can't be fully representative because that group is usually 6 people, but we try as best as we can to make sure that our people putting the input into these things is diverse, mainly so that we can catch anything that might be triggering or anything that might be kind of written in the wrong way or worded in the wrong way that could be offensive, but also just to make sure that we have that input from different people. We want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to contribute to this in some way. And I, by no means, am an expert in this field, and so I want other people to say, actually, you've written this, that's completely wrong, what are you talking about? So even if I was talking about the Romans, which is my area of expertise, if you want to call it that, I'd still want other people to pull me up on things if I get it wrong. So so we've consulted a lot of different people.
I think it's a really good way of doing it. It sounds like fantastic practice. So many people confessed to witchcraft, did so through torture. And I understand that when we did our episode on it, a lot of these people actually thought they had practiced witchcraft, whether they had knowingly done it or not. But what did the actual practice of witchcraft at that time look like? So
the vast majority of people who were practicing would have been healers and so you can kind of look at magical practice in a couple of different ways. One is healing, one is kind of traditional medicine almost. almost, we would class it as nowadays. So that's using herbs and plants and things to cure, to treat people. This is at a time where science and medicine, there's a fine line between what we would consider as magic and what's considered as science. And even to the point where religion sort of comes into this, where prayer is prescribed as a way of healing people. And that's something that you could almost look at as kind of magical practice, saying words to cause and effect, which is what magical practice is all about. Very similar patterns. So there's very blurred lines at this time, which is why many people who were healers and midwives and things actually didn't kind of necessarily get accused of this, because they were practicing these things that were so embedded already within medicine and science. They could sort of get away with it. But there were other people who were kind of in positions of power. So we talked about the John Dee features in the exhibition. John Dee was in a position of power. He was an alchemist, an astrologer. And what I kind of see when we look at these people is they're usually fairly well-off men in positions of power, and so they were allowed to practice magic because they already had that position within society. John Dee was an interesting case where he lost that power because James I came along, who was so against magical practice and witchcraft that it was a sort of unfortunate timing, really, that John Dee continued into this new reign where magic and witchcraft were so completely abolished and kind of seen as this horrific, scary thing.
One of the things I was going to talk about as well is that before John Dee, obviously, for the dissolution of the monasteries, the church actually held on to most of the magical texts that were being produced, and the priests and the monks who were scribing were probably the ones doing most of the magical practice in that time. And then you get Francis Young, who's a historian, wrote about the democratization of magic, which then leads to John Dee. But the church was still using magic in some ways, because you do find these sort of carvings like the witch traps and the demon traps all over churches still, and there's even evidence of
burying
like
a black
curses.
dog to be the first thing that is buried. That's not in the Bible.
Yeah. And then, but there's evidence in some churches of actual people writing in Latin or using spells out of Latin books, carving curses into the church wall to like amp up their effect. And there was stories about priests actually taking money from their parishioners to then go and do this in the back room somewhere. Wow. It's such a different style of magic from what these people were being accused of. It's like the difference between writing and reading in Latin and like with the Latin and the English Bible that you have on display out there.
But you see that still today. You still see people in positions of power dictating what is right and what is wrong. Yet they are the first people to do those things themselves. They just happen to have the money and the authority to make that go away if they get caught, which they usually don't, because they get it kind of put to one side before they even get caught. But you see that there. You see that with anyone in a position of power was allowed to do it because you just pay a fine. And you see that with a lot of aspects, not just with witch trials. You see that with a lot of criminal activity throughout the histories. I've done some research into kind of other areas as well, out of interest, and you see that with kind of punishment of sexuality as well throughout history, where under the Buggery Act it was illegal to be kind of have same-sex relationships as well as lots of other sexual acts. But the vast majority of the time, people weren't punished, they were fined. And a fine is basically a punishment for the poor, because the rich can afford to just say, fine, I'll give you money, don't bother me anymore. But the poor will be the ones that suffer because they can't.
A little bit like lockdown parties.
Well.
It all comes around again, doesn't it?
Yeah, money buys you freedom. What is your favourite object in this current exhibition?
I think it's still the original object that was meant to be the focus of the exhibition. It's the Malleus Maleficarum. Yeah. Simply because it's such a pivotal object and it shows such a turning point in this. And we know people who were believed to be witches were executed and punished, etc., before these laws came into effect, usually under heresy. So they were seen as religious opposition, which is why they were burned, and then why the witches under the later acts were hung instead. That's the distinction, because they were kind of punished as through acts of harm and murder, in a sense. But that book is such an important part of the history of these trials, and led to so many other books of similar sorts being produced and spread across the world. It wasn't the Malleus specifically, but it was its descendants and the Matthew Hopkins book that would have been inspired by previous generations of books like this that led to Salem, what happened in Salem, all the way across the Atlantic. It's through this idea of mass printing that you have this huge boom in ideas being shared and transmitted, which can be a wonderful thing. The idea of ideas being shared across the world sounds wonderful, and it can be. But also, if you're sharing the wrong ideas, that can be equally. If you have an audience who's not trained to critically assess the sources they're looking at, or something we have with social media nowadays.
I was going to say, from marketing seller to the internet, it's wonderful.
Anyone can put anything out there. But unless you know how to critically assess a source, then people will believe things. And the way the education system works, then to a degree now, sometimes people aren't taught that what you kind of read isn't always the truth. And people have reasons for writing what they do. And that isn't always, they're not always good reasons why they do that.
And our final question is, have you ever seen a ghost yourself?
So, I haven't seen... So I've worked here in Colchester Castle for about 7 years now. I have done many after-hours events. I have spent a lot of time here when it's dark. You hear a lot of noises, which is fairly standard for an old building. The one instance that sticks in my memory, though, is it was myself and one other person were in the building. This was a couple of years ago now, I think before the pandemic. Probably. We were both upstairs, tidying away, looking up. And as you will have seen, you both, when you came in here, there's a sensor up there that triggers when anyone walks in. And it sets off a sound, interactive thing in the prison cells, and shadows and things like that. As I said, we were both upstairs. The sensor, as far as I was aware, was pointed into the room, and it went off. And we could hear it, the sound coming up. It's quite distinctive, well recognised, especially as someone who's been here for a long time. The voice and narrative that you hear, it's not... Sometimes people will say, oh, I hear voices, but it's probably just people outside in the street. This is quite a distinctive voice. Now, that voice obviously is not a ghost, it's the recording. But who or what could have triggered that monitor, I have no idea.
It would need to be something quite substantial, wouldn't it? Not just like a cobweb or...
Yeah, and because of that, we do try and make sure there are no cobwebs or anything up there, because it will trigger all the time. It gets quite annoying if it keeps going off, which is why right now it's turned around so that it doesn't go off. But it takes quite a bit and quite a sizable kind of disturbance in the room to make it trigger. And it's not the only time. The person I was with said, oh yeah, it happens all the time when you're alone.
When I used to work mostly on the upper floor galleries, and I did my patrolling here, and I used to listen because there was several interactive displays that would go off, so I used them to figure out where people were coming up to in the castle, and then I could kind of like stand in the right place. But I actually used to sit at the top of those stairs. That was my favourite place to sit when it was quiet, and I did used to hear it going off all the time, but I didn't always come down and see if anybody was in here. So I don't know, it could have been going off by itself, it might not have been, but I actually did have my scariest moment in this room. I was hoovering in here after lockdown, and I backed up towards the door over there, and then I just saw a little bit of rubbish on the ground, and I went forward to go get it, and my belt loop had somehow become completely twisted into the door handle, and it honestly felt like somebody had like grabbed me like that. I did scream a bit.
Yeah, you would.
But so because this is the thing, these prison cells are a later addition. They're not the original cells from kind of back in the witch trials. They were still functional cells, because this was a prison up until the kind of early 1800s, I think, maybe the mid 1800s. And the castle has been a prison for most of its history. That was what it was, or a jail. So that's another thing. I only recently understood the difference between prison and jail, and that's a distinction that's important for this. So
I don't know that.
So a jail is somewhere where someone is kept before they are sentenced.
Right.
So the castle was used as a place to detain people while they were awaiting sentencing, and a prison is where you go as a punishment.
Right.
So you're sent to a prison if you're being punished.
Pre and post sentence.
Yeah. So although sometimes people would come back to the jail temporarily after they've been sentenced for various reasons, predominantly it was you were here pre-sentencing. But also with Colchester, with the castle, because the jail here was so awful and the conditions were so bad, Many people died before they were even sentenced, and they were kept here. And even the famous case of the North East Essex witch trials that we know of as the Manningtree witch trials, they were kept here for a very long time. And it's surprising that not all of them died while they were waiting their sentencing, to be honest, because there are a lot of them in here and the conditions were awful. And the other thing is the way the prison of the jail worked at the time is that you wouldn't get fed unless someone else could provide those provisions for you, unless you paid for that service. So
didn't some people end up staying longer because they couldn't afford to pay the fee?
Yeah, they couldn't pay the fee off. Even if they were innocent, they had to stay until they could pay it off.
It's a vicious cycle. You kind of get caught in that, and that's why many people died. And you had this other space which is in the Lucas Vault, which is another area of the castle, called the Little Ease, which was basically a hole in the ground with a ladder.
Oubliette.
Yes, an oubliette. So you kind of, the oubliette is French for kind of forgotten, so you put someone down there and they're forgotten about and they're kind of left there as a punishment. And we know of people, so James Parnell is a good example, a young Quaker who was put in there. And because he'd been so weakened by being left in this kind of space, eventually, when he was trying to get out of this prison, they were allowed to get out every so often. When he was trying to get out, he fell and broke various bones and ended up dying as a result of this, being in such a weakened state. So horrific. And obviously designed to cause torment and suffering. It's not just these were cells and people, it just ended up being a bit grotty. They were designed to be punishing.
Wow, I think that
wraps it up.
Wraps it up. Well, thank you so much, Ben. It's been a real delight talking to you, and we really enjoyed the exhibition.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, highly recommended. What days are you open, and what's the entrance price?
Yep, Colchester Castle is open every day of the week, apart from, I think, Christmas Day. The exhibition's on until the 6th of January. I'm not sure of the entrance prices, but please look at our website and find out the entrance prices. I don't really deal with prices, I don't really know. But if you are a resident of Colchester, you can get an annual membership where you pay for one ticket and you can come in as many times within a year. So it's very worthwhile doing that if you want to.
We can put a link in the show notes.
We will put a link in the show notes. And the exhibition is called Wicked Spirits. And
come and see it.
Yeah, definitely come and see it. Hi all, just Elsa back again. We've been a bit remiss in thanking our Patreon donors over the last couple of episodes, so let me just do this here. Our newest donors are Annie Caradillo, Joe Hickey Hall, Holly Allred, Adam Thomas, Tanner Johnson, and Richard Stokes. Thank you everyone, sorry that was Casper. Thank you everyone for donating. We're so thankful for all of your donations. They really do help us keep the lights on here at Eerie Essex.